Hello, folks. My name is Chris Rains with Rains Broadcasting, and I have on the line with me today Ben Loftus, and he is what are you? You were an engineer with Harrison?
Yes, I'm an engineer at Harrison. I do a lot of software development, and I'm also the product manager for this Mixbus product, among others.
And today we are going to do an overview of Mixbus, which is Harrison's DAW. They have a new DAW, and they've taken a very different approach to many of the other DAWs out there in the market. Now, I have a recording studio, and I've been using the Logic 9 and Studio One 2 from Presonus for the last few years. And I came across this DAW on the internet, and I decided to buy it because I really liked the way it looked, and I liked what I read in terms of the philosophy, and I've been using it here for the last month. And I was excited enough about this to agree to do this whole series of videos. So Ben, I'd like you to explain to the folks, first of all, what your philosophy is and how it differs from the other DAWs out there.
Sure, I'll be happy to. I guess the main difference is that when we approached making a DAW, we came at it from the standpoint of somebody who already makes mixers. So when we look at DAWs, we see all those limitations that were happening with computers in the early or mid 80s and early 90s, when a computer could only run a few bands of equalization at a time. And it was very limited in CPU resources, so a lot of the conventions that built up, like plugins, were made not because they were good ideas, but because they were compromises to work around the problems of that time. So, for example, the early DAW developers said, "Oh, I'd like to put an EQ on all these 12 channels because that's what the recording engineer expected," but the computer couldn't do that. So the DSP developers that they asked to help them make these equalizers said, "I'll tell you what, I'll make an equalizer, but you have to choose which of those 12 channels to put it on." And that compromise has flown through and built itself into our whole industry as the way things ought to be. And I'm not dissing plugins. Plugins are really cool, and they make a lot of sense for the same reason that they made sense to patch things into your analog console. You know, you needed to patch in a reverb. You needed to patch in a really great compressor occasionally. But the meat and potatoes work, the actual art of mixing, was sitting in front of a board that had all of the features that you need to do those bread and butter things: level controls, equalization, dynamics controls, and just to have that right in front of you. And that was completely lost in the workstations of the time. And so we went looking for a way to make a Harrison style mixer, something that we would consider a real mixer inside a DAW.
Well, this is what drew me to it. I mean, I really like the bus system that you have here, but I mean, just looking at the mixer portion of this DAW right here, you can see it with my mouse. I'll move it around a little bit here. You've got unlimited tracks, which I liked, and on each individual track you've got EQ, and you have some basic routing here to go to your buses, and then you've got a full compressor limiter here, right where it should be, and where it's not in a lot of the other DAWs. Now, I've talked to you before about this. I've got $10,000 worth of Universal Audio plugins. Before I discovered your DAW, I mean, those are the things that I use to create sound, and I still do that, and I can still pull those up. But it's really fantastic to be able to just simply get a really nice, clean, live sound and use the basic EQs and the compressor that you have here on each individual track. So why don't we just quickly go through and start at the top. I've named this track Ben's Folly. That's just a joke, Ben. And we'll go through and we'll explain to people each one of these things in track, because it can be quite overwhelming for people when they first look at a large console. I remember the first time I went into a big recording studio and looked at, for example, a Neve console. That's what happened to be in that studio. And it was completely overwhelming for me until I sat down with the engineer. I was 20, I think, 20 years old. And he showed me that one strip that was repeated all the way through. Then it started to become a little bit clearer to me. So let's go through and do that, okay? We go up here to Ben's Folly. This is where you name the track. And when you click on it, you can rename it. You can change the color, so you can color code your tracks. You've got track comment, track direct outputs. Just briefly, what does that mean?
That means that every track has a direct output, just like a console has an output, and you can take those track outputs and direct them to your sound card outputs, for example.
This is a patch bay.
It's a patch bay,
yeah.
And every channel has a direct output. So if you wanted to do analog mixing, for example, you could do all of your recording in Mixbus, do some equalization and compression with the tracks, but instead of using our Mixbuses and master bus, you could patch directly out and into an analog console, for example. You can also take these direct outs and route them into headphone feeds, for example, or you could route them into, for example, the sidechain feeds of the Mixbus compressors. And I actually have a short video on YouTube that explains how to take those track direct outputs and route them into the Mixbus sidechain inputs.
All right. Well, we'll be including that in this series of videos, and we'll provide that information for people later on. Now, let's move on here to this part here where my mouse is. I'll click on that, and this is for selecting your inputs, is it not?
Yes, that's correct. And because this is a stereo track, you're seeing stereo pairs of inputs, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. If you'll go to the channel right next door, you'll see that it only has it's a mono track, so it allows you to select from the mono inputs of your sound card.
So this particular track here, the 1 and 2, this is a stereo that I dragged in, stereo files of a live session. And when I go over to vocal and click on that, this is the microphone that I'm using, and selecting the input 1, which is where it's going into my Apollo system here, my interface. So so that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you just go down and you basically select your input.
Right.
All right, and what's this symbol here?
Okay, that's a phase invert switch, or a polarity invert.
Yeah.
So if you're recording, for example, a snare and you have a microphone on the top and bottom of the snare, it is sometimes beneficial to flip the phase.
And listen.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that basically just changes the sound. When you invert it, it can actually, the two microphones can interfere with each other if their positioning is wrong. And so when you flip it, you can really hear a difference in sound. It can be thin, and then suddenly it's a nice warm fat sound, right? And that's when you know it's in the right spot.
Right, and a lot of engineers would say you can slide the tracks to get things in phase, and I agree with that 100%. Sometimes having this button right under your fingers, if you click the button and it suddenly sounds a lot better, then the job is done. No more work needed.
Yeah, that's how I do it. Yeah, you use your ears. All right, well, let's go down to the next area here, and it says fader. So I will pull up a plugin. I'll right-click, and I'll go to New Plugins. And I'm going to go to Creator and down to Universal Audio. And you can see I've got quite a few Universal Audio plugins here. And let's just take a basic, reverb.
Yeah.
So now what's happened here, now that I've selected EMT 140 plugin, which is a great reverb. And what it's done when I instantiated it was automatically put some of these controls in place here. And we can talk about that. Now I see here that when I did this, it's above this fader mark. So explain to people what this means and what the difference is between it being there and here, above and below this fader.
Okay, well this black, what we call the redirect area, is the area where you order your plugins, your sends, and your hardware inserts with the existing EQ, compressor, and fader that are part of Mixbus. So in your example right now, the reverb comes before the fader. when you swapped it below the fader, that meant that the reverb came after the fader. So if you wanted to compress and equalize the signal before the reverb, then you would do like you've just done, put it underneath the fader. So now the signal path will go from the input through the fader section, which includes the compressor and EQ built into Mixbus, and then through the reverb.
Okay. And then through the reverb. Okay. Well, we'll get into this in more detail, in some of the training videos. We'll take each one of these and we'll go into much greater detail. We just want to give people a sort of a general feel of what's available here. If I right-click on this area again, there's quite a few different things under these headings. There's a new plugin which I use to put a plugin in. There's new insert. Why don't I click on that and you can explain to the folks what that means?
Okay, an insert is a pair of hardware inputs and outputs, or you can imagine it's like a patch bay.
Yeah.
And it creates a port to send out from this mono track and a port to return back into this mono track. And you could have multiples of these inserts on the track. And these ports allow you to, for example, hook in if you had an outboard compressor, an LA2A, or whatever kind of compressor that you wanted to use on this track, you can route from that point into that piece of hardware and back into this track again. And because it's ordered along with those other devices, you could put it pre-fader, post-fader, you could put it before that EQ or after that reverb, before the reverb, after the reverb. You get to order exactly how these things happen.
All right. Well, yeah, again, we'll get into this in much more detail in a later video. But, I mean, looks like to be an extremely flexible system in terms of, like, if you've ever had to crawl behind and use a patch bay, which I have had to do, you wish you had never started it. It can be quite complex. Now, and it's the same with the sends. You want to send out, basically send your signal out to a reverb, for example, that you've got up, and then bring it back in. You can do that with multiple tracks, right?
That's right.
All right. And now, what's this active and deactive?
Okay, that affects the plugin that you right-clicked on. In this case, it's that insert. So if you choose activate, you'll see that insert loses the parentheses around it. In Mixbus, an active and inactive plugin is shown by a pair of parentheses. Now, the way that I do that is I use the middle button on my mouse. I don't know if the mouse you're using has a wheel. Normally the wheel is considered the middle mouse button, and you can click on that plugin or insert and it enables and disables it.
All right. I have a mouse that's got two buttons and a wheel and then a roller ball.
Okay. Does the wheel click like a button?
No, it doesn't.
Oh, okay.
It does not. So I'll have to activate and deactivate it. So I'll deactivate that, and then I will activate that. And there you go. It takes it in and out. All right, so let's move on to, because this is just an overview, we do not want to delete anything at this point. Cut, copy, paste, it's all pretty straightforward. Rename, activate all, deactivate all, and that means activate all of the things that are in this black area.
Right.
Right? Okay, and exit. All right, so now let's move down just quickly to this area here where it's got the controls. Basically, when I instantiated the EMT140, it put some of these controls here that you would see. Instead of having to open it up, I'll open up the 140 here so people can see it. And here's all the controls. There's the damper. You can see it going up and down here. Damper A. So that basically gives you more or less reverb.
Right.
The damper, right? Again, we won't get into too much detail, but it just shows people that what you guys have done here basically is you've made it so that when you do put a plugin in place, you don't have to keep opening and closing it in order to get the basics. And if I want to change what these things do, if I don't want to bother changing the plate, it appears to select the number of options that I have. I've got 4 here, depending on the size of my screen. Now, if I were to expand this, would I get more?
No, not in this version of the software.
No. Will that change in the upcoming versions? It's
not on our immediate to-do list, but it could.
It could. Okay, I notice there's quite a few more options here over on the buses. But you don't have all this is a matter of size, I guess, because you have your EQ and your routing and all that stuff that you do not have over in the bus area.
Right. So we utilize that space to give you more control, parameter controls over, for example, your reverbs and plugins that are likely to be on those buses.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move down to EQ. Now, this is a deceptively simple looking. You've got low, mid, and high. And what are these buttons here? Explain to people what they are.
Oh, okay. Those are these frequency knobs. So you can sweep the frequency of each of the equalizer bands. So, for example, the low frequency can go anywhere from, I believe, maybe 40 hertz to 400 hertz.
And people can see that if they look down in the area where the name is, about the middle, just below here, you'll see it changing as I'm moving the mouse. It's actually giving you the sweep in numbers. And I'll go to the mids, and I'll sweep there. You can see it changing, which is really cool. It automatically changes from the name of the track to the information that you need for that particular knob. And here now, now you double click, don't you, in order to zero these things out?
Right, and you'll also notice that when you zero something out, its indicator, the knob pointer, goes very dim.
Yeah.
And that's a really convenient feature when you have a lot of things turned on and set on the board. You can quickly sweep your eyes across the mixer and see which knobs have been turned and which ones are at their default positions.
Yeah, I think that's very cool because it tells you, where you've worked and where you might need to do something. Now, explain to the people here your choice of a 3-band. This is a semi-parametric EQ,
right?
And why you chose to go with this EQ rather than a 4-band parametric EQ or something else that you could have chosen to put in there.
Well, like every engineering exercise, it's a compromise of space and features and functionality. And we also did some research because we also make high-end digital consoles for film and music. We had some experience with when people sent session files into us. We could see how many bands of EQ and what the shapes of those EQ were.
Yes.
And although it wasn't uncommon for people to use all 8 bands of EQ on our big consoles, the most common thing was a little bass boost, a little treble boost, and a little mid notch because we all know that makes everything sound better.
Yeah. And
I say that as jokingly, but it really is so often the case because there can be so much energy, especially when you're working around lead vocal or around dialogue. You really want to massage that mid-range energy and give everything a space to live in. And so a shelving low and high band EQ that have gentle slopes that give you some basically tone controls, and then a mid band. And let me make a point about the mid band. It's based on a circuit that was used in some very, very early Harrison consoles, analog consoles. And that circuit has the property that when the gain is boosted a lot or cut a lot, the Q becomes very narrow. And when you just do a little bit of adjustment, the Q becomes very wide. And that gives you a couple of cool things. To do some gentle tone controls, if you just want to dip the mids a little bit, then you can just move it a few dB and it'll affect a very broad range.
Yeah.
And sound very natural. If you really are trying to fix something that you don't like in a snare, or you're trying to bring out the body of a snare, then you can, let's say you wanted to accentuate the body of a snare. You could turn the gain up very loud, which means that it'll become a very sharp Q, and you can then sweep the frequency until you hear that snare body sound get very accentuated. Okay?
Yeah.
And then you can reduce the amount of gain until it sounds about right. But having that high peak shape helps you dial in the frequency really easily. If you wanted to get rid of that body sound, if you had a ring in the snare that you want to get rid of, you'd do the same thing. You could boost it a lot, sweep the frequency until you found exactly what you're after, and then turn the gain all the way down, and that will create almost a notch filter. It'll be a very tight Q with a lot of gain reduction right there at the frequency you've selected, so you can notch that section out. All that within just these 3 equalizer bands.
Yeah, I guess it's not what you got, it's how you use it that counts, eh?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, well, like I said, we'll go over this in a lot more detail. This actually requires a full video, I think, just the EQ. I think what we can do is I will get some live audio here. We're going to do a bunch of recording in the next few weeks, and we'll take some of those tracks and we'll do a whole session where we use the EQ and the compressor to play with those live inputs. And let people have a listen, right? Because nothing beats being able to hear it when you're changing it. So, okay, so let's move down to this next section here, this sort of beigey brown section. And let's explain to people what this does.
Okay, those are your bus sends, and you can turn on that indicator to send the sound over to Mixbus number 1, which in this case is color-coded yellow.
Yes.
And you have a knob beside it which allows you to adjust the send level. So you can imagine that this is like an aux send on an analog console.
Yep.
So if I have a reverb on bus 1, for example, I can adjust how much of my sound on this track that I want to send over to my reverb.
All right, so let's just do that. Let's just select this. Down here a little bit so we can hear over top of it. This is a live recording that we did in our studio here with young jazz musicians who also do blues. Now you can see the signal coming through the track itself, and now we have selected in the number 1 bus here. We've turned that on and it's sending it over to the bus, which you can see over here, Mixbus 1. Can you see that, Ben?
Yeah, looks great.
Let's turn this up a little bit. You can see the meters moving.
Sounds great.
Yeah, simple. Just like the engineer. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's this is what blew me away when I first saw this, was the routing, for example. Basically, you click the button. I understood right away as soon as I saw it what it did. The way you guys have things laid out. You click on it and it shows up. All right. Ben, the next thing we're going to talk about is a high-pass filter in the EQ section. And explain to the folks a little bit about this, what function this has.
The high-pass filter allows you to quickly go through all those tracks that might be causing a little bit of that mud down at the bottom end, and without getting a plug-in, without making a production app, you can quickly just turn up the high-pass filter a little bit on each of those tracks that might be taken away from the bass of the important bass tracks. And you can also use it as an artistic tool if you want to combine it with the EQ to make someone with sort of a telephone voice, where the bandwidth is very limited. That's a pretty common production technique these days.
Well, let's play with it just a little bit. I'm going to turn the music on here, and I'll just run through the high-pass filter just quickly and let people hear what that sounds like. Yeah, that's the music through the telephone sound.
Right.
Its natural state is right to the left, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. This would not be my preference for a blues song, but but I can see where you can easily tone shape, particularly things with a lot of low end, really tone shape this kind of stuff.